The most heartwarming show on TV was The Repair Shop, where broken family treasures and the memories they held were brought back to life. But what if, behind those soft smiles and calming tones, there was a story that no one saw coming? A story of trauma, death, and silence that was slowly coming apart. This sad secret changed more than one person's life. It also changed the show forever, that hurt the Repair Shop's feelings so much that it finally closed down. What did happen when those barn doors were closed? That's not good. You'll understand why at the end of this movie. The barn that fixed what was broken. The Repair Shop didn't look like the kind of show that would start a fashion trend at first glance. There were not any bright lights, dramatic music cues, or planned fights. But what it did offer was something that modern TV had quietly stopped having. Real personal bond. In a calm Sussex barn full of old tools and natural light, a group of skilled craftspeople worked quietly to fix up broken family heirlooms. There was a story behind everything, not just the thing itself but also the people who had something to do with it. A music box that used to put a child to sleep, a clock that used to be in the kitchen of a grandfather, a bear that was sewn together by a parent who is no longer alive. It wasn't just fixes, they were like emotional archaeology because they brought up memories, pain, love, and family history. And this may have been the very key to the show's success. It didn't act like everything was fine, or that damage was a bad thing. Indeed, it moved toward the idea that people and things could be used, scarred, or even broken, and still look beautiful again. The barn had its own energy because of this philosophy. It was part workshop and part refuge. Anyone there could have cried, not just the guests. There was something holy about the area, but there was a weight behind that kindness that couldn't be seen. It's not just about the thing on the table when it comes to emotional healing. It means being with someone in their sadness for long enough to help them let go. Going through that every day while being watched by cameras gets old after a while. People liked the show because it had soul, but they didn't realize that the soul had to come from people who often did more than they had to. And Susie Fletcher was one of those people who carried a lot of quiet emotional weight. Her story would soon show that even doctors need to be healed sometimes. Susie Fletcher shows up quietly. When Susie Fletcher first came on The Repair Shop in 2018, there wasn't a lot of extra attention paid to her. Her leather tools were already out when she walked into the barn and got to work. She seemed steady and calm right away, like she had been there the whole time, even though we had only just met. But what most people didn't know and couldn't have known was that her arrival came after a life was quietly torn apart. Susie had been living abroad for years and had just come back to the UK. Her husband Rob had died of cancer of the pancreas. That's enough to throw a life off track. Susie didn't just go back home to grieve though, beginning again from the ashes of something much more complex than anyone could see. She didn't want to be on camera. Not because she was shy but because she was mentally worn out. She had nothing but bad thoughts about TV. She didn't want anyone to hear her. She wanted peace, habit, and maybe even to be invisible. Steve Fletcher, her brother and a big favorite on the show, pushed her to do it. He saw something in her that she hadn't seen in herself yet, and she finally agreed to join. Carefully and quietly, almost like someone dipping their toe into water they have never been in after a storm. As a saddler and leather expert, she was great for her job. The work was regular, tactile, and quietly hard. Having something to think about helped her, in a way that doesn't confuse, but rather grounds you. She didn't have to tell the crowd too much or explain herself. The things she used spoke for her. The way she worked was like talking, but she didn't have to say anything. People reacted right away to how real she seemed. She was the calm in the middle of the storm. She heard more than she spoke, and went into every repair with a sense of gentle reverence. But it wasn't just professional ease that came out of it. It was about staying alive. Piece by piece, she was putting together something of her own. Susie wasn't just going back to the UK either, even though she didn't talk about it much at the time. She was going back to being herself. As the seasons went on and Susie Fletcher's role on the show became more popular, she stayed mostly out of the public eye. Her kindness and care were real, but unlike many famous people, her personal life stayed out of the public eye. She wasn't meant to be mysterious. It was like she carried herself with a quiet pride. But that kindness hid a story that was much scarier than anyone knew. In 2023, Susie decided to talk in public for the first time about what she had been through in her marriage. She talked about not only losing her husband to cancer, but also years of abuse that she had hidden from everyone. In interviews, and later in her autobiography, she said that her violent and moody husband Rob had been her partner. In one terrifying memory, she talked about being choked so badly that she thought her life was over. She lived in a state of psychological survival for 15 years. The man she loved had his own problems. His past hurt him in ways that never got better. Finally, that pain spread to other people. But Susie didn't say anything, like many other survivors, not because they want to deny it, but because being in it for that long makes silence feel safer than being seen. You learn to deal with things, change, and stay alive. When her husband died in 2013, it was a hard loss. There was sadness, but there was also a sense of freedom. There is often a wave of guilt that comes after leaving a violent relationship. Who are you sad about? The person they were or the person you thought they'd be? And this is where things get really sad. This trauma hadn't been dealt with by the time Susie started working at the repair shop. It was split up into sections. Putting it away like an old bag, she couldn't see it but couldn't forget about it either. She didn't just want to get rid of the stress by talking about it now. 10 years later, it was a big surprise. People who had seen her support others were shocked when they heard the truth. The woman who was helping everyone get better had been quietly broken herself. Even though the barn had helped her heal, it was only one part of her journey to get better. Part 2 was still waiting to be told. It hurts off the camera, but feels better on it. It's kind of strange how shows like The Repair Shop work. There is a soft space between them that is neither documentary nor fiction. In this space, real people relive emotional times while soft camera lights shine on them. For someone like Susie Fletcher, that setup was both helpful and annoying. She was calm and collected on camera, the kind of person you'd naturally trust with something important. It could be a 100-year-old saddle, or your own childhood memories. But what viewers didn't see was how the show's atmosphere and encouragement of emotional openness often matched her own unspoken grief. Susie didn't just do her job in the barn. It helped her deal with her pain by focusing it on something specific and useful. It helped her control her emotions to do the same thing over and over, to stitch carefully, and to feel the old leather in her hands. For people who have been through tragedy, that kind of routine can be like air. But there was another side. When people came in, their eyes would be big with hope, and their hands would shake as they looked at their family heirlooms. They would laugh and cry together, and tell stories of grief and making it through. Susie, who was always polite, would listen. She would nod her head sometimes. Sometimes she would say something nice, but most of the time she would soak up their feelings like a sponge, showing that she cares without ever telling her own story. Her co-workers praised how strong she was. It was funny when Richard Biggs joked that he had a crush on her, but there was a deep understanding there. Anyone who knew Susie knew she was carrying a lot. She was the calm center of the barn. She helped everyone else, and never asked for anything in return. The body does notice mental work, especially the kind that can't be seen. It all adds up. That being said, even the toughest people start to feel their weaknesses over time. On camera, Susie was fixing things. Behind the scenes though, she was slowly coming to the realization that it might be time for her to start fixing herself too. The moment the mask came off, it's strong when someone who has been quiet finally speaks up. Susie Fletcher kept her past hidden from her for many years, not hid out of shame, but sealed, like when you close a box that hurts too much to open again. She did what many survivors do. She stayed alive. She tailored her life to be strong, helpful, and full of things to do. And that worked well for her at the repair shop. But the strongest structure can only last for so long. Susie's autobiography, The Sun Over the Mountains, came out in 2023. Just reading the title felt like getting a message. There was darkness, but the story was about how to get back to the light. What came next was not just a retelling. As a quiet act of resistance, it was a taking back. She talked about the fear, the confusion, and the years of living in constant worry. She described the choking incident with horrifying clarity, saying, "I honestly thought I was going to die." That sentence, so calmly stated, in matter of fact, landed like a thunderclap. For many fans, the moment was the first time they realized just how much she had endured, while appearing so calm, so composed, so gentle. But this chapter in her life wasn't about shock value, it was about closure. Writing the book was her way of stitching herself back together, not with leather or thread, but with truth. She later described the writing process as cathartic, a form of release she didn't even know she needed until the words began to flow. What makes this chapter of her story so profound is what it redefined. Every old episode now looked different. The scenes where she listened quietly to a guest's story, the tears she blinked back, the silence between her words. Viewers began to realize she wasn't just being empathetic, she was relating deeply, intimately, and silently. The mask hadn't cracked all at once, it had slipped gently, slowly in her own time, and when it did, it didn't ruin the image we had of her. It deepened it, gave it weight, made it real. But emotional honesty has a ripple effect, and once her story was out in the world, the equilibrium she had found in the barn began to shift. The barn's emotional toll. The repair shop was always more than a TV set. For those who worked there, it was a living, breathing, emotional ecosystem. It's easy to forget that while the cameras rolled, while the music swelled, and while the edits tied everything up with a hopeful bow, the people inside the barn were absorbing a tremendous emotional load. Every item brought into that workshop came wrapped in layers of memory, longing, and grief. A hand-carved toy passed through generations, a cracked clock that ticked through the years of a marriage, a faded photograph embedded into a music box. These weren't just objects, they were memory vessels. In memory, as anyone who's lived with loss knows, can weigh more than stone. For Susie and the rest of the cast, it wasn't just about restoring these things, it was about holding the emotional space for the people who brought them in. To listen to someone describe their mother's last days, to hear a child's voice tremble when talking about a late grandparent, and then return to your workbench and stitch through that emotion with quiet hands. That's not a skill, that's emotional labor, and it's often invisible. Filming days were long. Guests sometimes cried on set, experts did too. There were moments, rarely shown, where production paused because the emotions in the room became too raw. Even the toughest, most stoic experts had their breaking points, but the barn, for all its peace and quiet, didn't have a place for emotional release. The work had to go on. Susie especially seemed to carry more than most. She had become in many ways the emotional anchor of the team. Her quietness wasn't emptiness, it was capacity. She had room for other people's stories. She made them feel safe. But when you're always the one holding space for others, who's holding space for you? That unspoken question hung in the background, and over time it started to manifest, not in breakdowns or outbursts, but in exhaustion, burnout, and quiet withdrawal. The show still looked the same on the outside, but inside the barn, a slow emotional fatigue had begun to take root, and just as that emotional weight was becoming harder to carry, a much louder disruption crashed into the world of the repair shop. When the storm came, Jay Blades' fall. Until 2024, Jay Blades was untouchable. He was the face of the repair shop, the guiding voice, the warm presence that welcomed guests and tied each story together. Viewers trusted him. They saw him as a kind of emotional translator, someone who could speak for both the experts and the guests, who could navigate between craftsmanship and connection. But then came the headlines. Details were murky at first, then they sharpened. Jay had been charged, the specifics still unfolding, and suddenly the entire tone of the show changed. The BBC responded swiftly. Episodes were pulled, tours were postponed, and in the public eye, trust wavered. This wasn't just about legal trouble, this was about the collapse of the show's symbolic foundation. Jay wasn't just the host, he was the barn's voice, the man who stood in the doorway, and told us week after week that every object has a story. And when his story shifted, when scandal replaced sincerity, the audience felt a betrayal, not just of trust, but of tone. Suddenly the soft-spoken, emotionally rich universe of the repair shop had a shadow over it. For someone like Susie already standing on fragile emotional ground, this was more than just bad press, it was destabilizing. The barn had been her refuge, a safe space she could rely on to stay consistent, and now even that wasn't immune. Insiders reported that morale dipped, momentum slowed. The show, once defined by emotional transparency,
was now tangled in silence, speculation, and discomfort, and the cracks that had already begun to show, they started to widen. But the most telling part wasn't the scandal itself, it was how the show responded. The BBC downplayed it, postponed things, avoided direct comment. It wasn't just Jay who stepped back, it was clarity, it was honesty, two things that had defined the barn for years. The storm had arrived, and whether or not anyone admitted it, it left damage behind, cracks in the workshop. After the headlines faded, and the public moved on to the next big story, the repair shop didn't implode, it didn't vanish. There were no cancellations, no last episode farewells. Instead, something subtler happened, something quieter. The show began to thin out. Tour dates that had once sold out in minutes were now postponed, or quietly downsized. Promotional posters still included familiar faces, but fans began noticing that some of those people, most notably Susie Fletcher, weren't actually appearing. Social media accounts grew less active. Comments from loyal viewers started asking the same question, where is everyone? But the real shift was less about attendance, and more about energy. The barn felt different. Something intangible had been lost. That sense of comfort, that feeling of being wrapped in a warm emotional blanket, that wasn't as present anymore. And the viewers, even if they couldn't quite articulate it, felt it internally. Sources suggested fatigue was setting in. The emotional intensity of the show, once a strength, had become a kind of slow-burning liability. Experts were burning out. Stories were beginning to blur together. The formula, beautiful in its simplicity, started to feel strained, and at the center of it all, the most glaring absence, was Susie. She hadn't made a public exit. There was no farewell moment, but she was gone. And that absence felt louder than any scandal. She had been the emotional core, not flashy, not loud, but steady. Without her, something had shifted. It was like removing the weight from a pendulum. The balance was off. The BBC tried to maintain the illusion. The barn still stood, the lights were still on, but more and more, it began to feel like a museum of what the show used to be, not a living, breathing space of connection, but a reenactment of one. And all of this was happening without anyone really saying it out loud, but the silence, that was telling. Susie steps away. It wasn't a headline. It wasn't even an official announcement, but it was there, hidden in plain sight. She hasn't done anything for a year. That quiet remark from fellow repair shop expert Richard Biggs didn't seem intended to make waves, yet for fans listening closely, it landed like a slow-motion shockwave. Susie Fletcher, the quiet heart of the show, hadn't appeared in a single episode for over 12 months. No on-screen farewell, no BBC statement, no send-off montage with soft music and a gentle voiceover, just absolute absence, and that absence was loud. For a long time, viewers hadn't noticed. Her presence had always been subtle, never seeking the spotlight, but the longer she was gone, the more obvious it became. The barn wasn't the same. The tone had shifted. The emotional glue that had once bound the workshop stories now felt weaker, more fragile. So why did she leave? There was not really a scandal, just a woman who had perhaps given all she could give. For years, Susie had poured herself into the emotional labor of the barn, helping others mend their keepsakes, while quietly carrying her own history of trauma, grief and survival. And maybe, just maybe, she realized it was time to stop being the caretaker for everyone else, and start taking care of herself. There's something deeply human about that kind of exit. Not grand, not explosive, just a quiet boundary drawn by someone who finally knew what she needed. But her decision to step away didn't just affect her own story, it marked a turning point for the show itself. With Susie's quiet departure, something essential slipped through the cracks. Not a ratings loss, not a budget issue, something more intangible, something harder to replace. The soul of the barn, the quiet, steady empathy at its center had begun to fade. The memoir, and the mirror. By now, Susie Fletcher's memoir had taken on a life of its own. The Sun Over the Mountains wasn't just a book, it was a mirror, one that didn't just reflect her story, but refracted everything viewers thought they knew about the repair shop. In its pages, Susie detailed her journey from the trauma of an abusive marriage to the slow process of emotional restoration. She wrote not with bitterness, but with clarity, with intention, with a kind of wisdom that comes only from years of reflection. And as she laid her truth bare, it became clear that the story was more than autobiography. The book was a companion piece to the show itself, a behind-the-scenes emotional blueprint of what the series really stood for. Because when you think about it, the repair shop was always a metaphor. The act of fixing broken objects was never really about the objects. It was about grief, about memory, about holding on and letting go. And Susie's life, as she shared it in her memoir, mirrored that exact arc. She had been shattered. Then she found something, a rhythm, a refuge, a workshop, where her hands could stay busy while her heart slowly healed. And finally, when she was ready, she walked away, not broken, but whole in a new way. What made the memoir so powerful wasn't just the revelations it offered, it was what it revealed about the show itself, that its emotional depth wasn't just edited in during post-production, it was real. It came from the people inside the barn. And now one of those people was telling us, this was real for me too. In doing so, she closed the loop, gave herself and her audience the closure the show had never formally offered, beyond the barn. And so what happens to a show when its spirit quietly leaves the building? Technically, the repair shop continues. The BBC still accepts submissions. The website is still up. Clips are still shared online. The familiar theme music still plays over reruns, but beneath the surface, something has shifted. You can feel it, like walking into an old house, where the furniture is still arranged, but the laughter is missing. Susie's name no longer features in promotional materials. Jay Blades remains a complicated figure, still associated with the show, but distant, his presence somewhat blurred by the unresolved controversy. The rest of the team, they carry on diligently doing the work, but the energy, that unmistakable emotional pulse, that once ran through the workshop feels fainter. What we're seeing now is a version of the show, not the show. This is what happens when format continues without foundation. You can replicate the steps, the repairs, the reveals, the gentle conversations, but without the emotional authenticity behind it, the magic doesn't land quite the same. And viewers know it. They may not say it outright, but they feel it. They miss something they can't name. Maybe it's the moments when Susie's quiet empathy balanced a tearful guest. Maybe it's the original chemistry. Or maybe it's just the knowledge that the show was once built on real emotional investment, not just production value. The barn hasn't collapsed, but it's changed. What remains is a kind of shell, familiar, functional, but missing the invisible thread that once held it all together. In the end, it wasn't a scandal or a rating drop that caused the ending of the repair shop. It was a tragic secret, carried in silence, and by the time anyone saw it clearly, it was too late to fix. Sometimes when something special breaks, you can fix it, and sometimes you have to accept that it's time to let it go. The repair shop without a heart. All in all, this is more than just a story. It's something far more human. The repair shop didn't implode overnight. It unraveled slowly, one emotional thread at a time. First through the quiet suffering that went unseen, then through a storm of controversy, and finally, through the quiet exits of the people who gave it heart. Susie Fletcher's tragic secret was the quiet fault line running beneath the entire show, proof that even in spaces built for healing, the people doing the healing can quietly be breaking. And that's what made the repair shop so special to begin with. It wasn't just about repairs, it was about resilience, about grace. It's about giving people and things the space to be whole again. But resilience has its limits, and grace, when unreciprocated, wears thin. Now what remains is a barn with beautiful lighting and expert hands, but without the quiet soul that once made it feel sacred.